In the first part of this series, we left off from Hungary in the mid-1840s, where the Hungarian Diet in Bratislava, then Pozsony, implemented landmark language laws in 1844. These laws replaced Latin, the traditional official language, with Hungarian across public life, in government, in education, and in administration, a culmination of more than 50 years of national and linguistic development in Hungary. This policy was a decisive step towards solidifying the Hungarian identity, but came at a steep cost. It directly targeted the Slovaks, Romanians, Croats, and many other ethnic minorities whom the Hungarian elite viewed as threats that needed assimilation through Magyarization. By this point, a formal Hungarian historical narrative had entrenched itself, from the Magyar tribes conquering the Pannonian Basin to St. Stephen establishing a Christian Hungary in 1000 AD, to the Golden Age under King Matthias. Magyarization surged ahead with little regard for the diverse populations in the Carpathian Basin, an oversight which would ultimately cost the Hungarians everything they had worked so hard for. Though united in the goal of Magyarization, Hungary's political elite differed on how to achieve it. Two towering figures, István Széchenyi and Lajos Kossuth, came to define these debates. István Széchenyi, often called the greatest Hungarian, a title humbly given to him by Kossuth himself, envisioned a modern, liberal Hungary. As a member of one of the nation's noblest families, Széchenyi funded national projects like the first permanent bridge connecting Buda and Pest, and founded the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He believed in gradual independence, secured under the protective wing of the Habsburg Empire. Having fought as a young man in the Napoleonic Wars for the Habsburg crown, he saw firsthand the clash of European civilization and knew that Hungary had a long way before it could hope to defend her sovereignty. In contrast, the young Lajos Kossuth, from a landless noble family in a region with a Slovak majority, was a fiery nationalist. His background blurred ethnic lines, though Kossuth self-identified as Hungarian. This despite having many family members who certainly would have not identified as Hungarian. His grandfather penned many letters which survive to this day, all of which were written in the Slovak language. Moreover, his uncle sympathized and was involved in the Slovak nationalist movement of the day. Therefore, it is important to remember how porous and intermingled the Kingdom of Hungary was when it came to dividing up the country by ethnicities. Things were not as black and white as history often remembers them to be. Kossuth represented the radical, impatient youth of Europe, passionate about liberalism and self-determination. Arrested in 1837 for his political views, his imprisonment only fueled his drive further. Upon his release, Kossuth's rhetoric became even more aggressive, demanding immediate Hungarian autonomy. Despite his certainly mixed ethnic background, Kossuth pushed for an aggressive assimilation of minorities. He believed giving credit to any minority groups would ultimately threaten Hungarian hegemony over the Pannonian Basin. Széchenyi, by contrast, knew that Hungary was more reliant on these minorities than Kossuth would have admitted. Széchenyi favored a passive, long-term assimilation through strength, not by force, outlining that Hungarians need to set a firm example and the other ethnic groups would follow suit, though he himself would not have supported Serb, Slovak, Romanian autonomy or recognition. This ideological clash defined the 1840s in Hungary. Széchenyi's patient, aristocratic approach versus Kossuth's aggressive nationalism and mass mobilization. Though Széchenyi's long-term strategy seemed to be winning out over the young radicals, the gears of history would soon start turning. By 1845, Europe was teetering. Several years of widespread crop failures and food shortages triggered unrest. The Irish potato famine devastated Ireland, but the rest of the continent experienced similar upheaval. The Habsburg Empire saw multiple food riots which had to be put down violently. The outdated feudal system was beginning to crash under the pressure of modernity. By February 1848, tensions boiled over in France. A revolution toppled the monarchy and birthed the Second Republic, inspiring radicals across Europe. This sent shockwaves across Europe, the likes of which hadn't been seen since the French Revolution. The springtime of nations dawned across Europe. Big cities across the continent saw riots and revolution break out. Young protesters seeking liberalization and democratization marched on the streets in the tens of thousands. On March 3, 1848, Kossuth addressed the Hungarian Diet, demanding democratic reforms and an end to royal absolutism, all the while professing loyalty to the Habsburgs. These ideas were extremely radical, even by the standards of Kossuth, and set the tone for a new era in Habsburg history. Days later, protests erupted in Vienna. Thousands clashed with police, forcing the monarchy to promise constitutional reform and lift censorship laws. Encouraged by Vienna's concessions, Hungarian radicals seized the moment. On March 15th, led by the poet Sándor Petőfi and the writer Mór Jókai, 5,000 protesters gathered in Budapest. They printed and distributed their 12 demands, or 12 pont, which called for press freedom, a national bank, and a parliamentary government in Budapest. By the early afternoon, 20,000 people had joined the crowd which gathered around the National Museum in Pest. Here, Petőfi recited his electrifying national song, or Nemzeti Dal, rallying the crowd with these famous lines. Talpra magyar, híja haza. Itt az idő, most vagy soha. Rabok legyünk vagy szabadok. Ez a kérdés, válasszatok. On your feet, magyar. The homeland calls. The time is here, now or never. Shall we be slaves or free? This is the question. Choose your answer. 2 days later, the Habsburg Emperor reluctantly appointed Lajos Bottyány as the head of Hungary's independent government, fearing a peasant army amassing around the figure of Petőfi. Hungary began drafting its first constitution, enfranchising nearly 10% of men, more than in contemporary Britain. For the moment, Hungary became the first constitutional monarchy east of the Rhine River. The absence of a detailed agreement immediately gave rise to problems and questions. Neither the emperor nor the new Hungarian government had clearly defined a framework for cooperation. Key issues remained unresolved. Who would be responsible for raising new troops? Where would the levied taxes be sent? The only stipulation was that the Kingdom of Hungary would be connected to the Habsburg Empire through the allegiance of the emperor. But no practical guidelines or mechanisms were outlined to ensure smooth governance. It would not take long for the other minorities in the empire to begin clamoring for recognition and autonomy, a fact which would come to be used by the Habsburgs to divide the Kingdom of Hungary. Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, and others began demanding their own rights. Kossuth and the Hungarian leadership, however, rejected their calls, fearing it would fracture the nation. Croatia, recognized as an autonomous entity within the Kingdom of Hungary since the 11th century, became a flashpoint. The Croatian elite still remembered that they voluntarily joined a union with Hungary and expected their distinct status to be remembered. The Habsburg Emperor had been weak in the face of mass unrest. However, a conservative cabal was forming in the aristocracy around the young Franz Ferdinand. This cabal sought to play the various minorities off against Hungary to undermine the new government of Bottyány. Backed by the Habsburgs, Joseph Jelačić, the Ban of Croatia, refused to recognize Hungarian authority. Jelačić mobilized Croatian forces and purged Hungarian officials, escalating tensions. He followed the Hungarian example in Croatia. The Croatians created a parliament and enfranchised nearly 3% of the male population. By May, they had held their very first elections and were well on the way to building their own modern national consciousness. Jelačić would ask the Croatian parliament, or the Sabor, "Half the empire are Slavs, but time and again we are squeezed and tortured like no other people." The Serbians quickly followed suit in southern Hungary. After their demands were rejected by Kossuth and Bottyány, they joined up with Jelačić and the Croatians, who together received backing from the Habsburgs. Skirmishes erupted between the Hungarians and the Serbs in the south, and for the first time in the region, attacks were being carried out with a specific intent of ethnically cleansing the area of one another. Vienna forbade Hungarian retaliation against the Serbs and Croats, seeking to further undermine Hungary. By now, the Habsburgs had fully realized that a violent contest with Hungary would be inevitable. By August 1848, Vienna was arming Jelačić and an army of 30,000 in Croatia. With Habsburg assurances of support, Jelačić marched on Budapest. Simultaneously, the emperor appointed a new head of Habsburg armies in Hungary. Kossuth would denounce the appointment, and the new army head was lynched in Pest by a violent mob. This was the ultimate casus belli for the Habsburgs. They used this to justify declaring the Hungarian Diet to be illegal and all those supporting Hungary to be traitors of the crown. Jelačić by now reached the outskirts of Pest County, but was routed by an army of 15,000 Green Hungarian recruits, dashing Habsburg hopes of an early end to the rebellion. Jelačić and his forces fled towards Vienna, where the young liberals were again out protesting. They saw the young Hungarian democracy as their ally in the fight for democratization and fought to disrupt the defensive preparations being made inside the city, quickly taking over Vienna and ousting the royalist forces. The Habsburg armies began to besiege the city. This is when the protesters reported seeing the Hungarian army approaching from the towers of St. Stephen's, giving them hope for ultimate liberation. The Hungarian army was, however, routed by Jelačić in the suburbs of Vienna, sealing the fate of the liberals trapped within the city. Once the royalist forces retook the city, they made hundreds of arrests and executed dozens, including a German parliamentarian who received no trial and had his immunity ignored. Soon, Hungary faced revolts in Transylvania and Slovakia, with Romanian and Slovak militias armed by the Habsburgs. Ethnic violence spiraled into brutal ethnic cleansing on both sides, shattering centuries of peaceful coexistence. Both sides attacked and burned villages, murdered local inhabitants indiscriminately. Historian John Connelly succinctly described the events in Hungary in late 1848. Quote, "The war itself had alienated virtually every group in Hungary, from the Magyar elites to Romanians and Germans in Transylvania, to Croats and Serbs in the south. Within a generation, scholars were applying a description to the internecine violence that did not exist before that time: racial war, a war between peoples involving not only ethnic cleansing, but also the mutual killing of townsfolk on a mass scale." End quote. In Transylvania alone, more than 40,000 died in this racial war, with more than 100 villages having been burned to the ground. The royalist forces would soon capture Buda and Pest, and the Hungarian cause seemed almost lost, when in December the emperor stepped down from the throne, and Franz Joseph I took the throne and vowed to restore imperial power over the empire. However, the young emperor immediately faced challenges. By spring 1849, Hungary's forces had launched a stunning counteroffensive, liberating Buda and Pest. But their triumph was short-lived. Despite their strategic success, the Habsburgs had realized they alone did not stand a chance against the Hungarian army. On the same day that the Hungarians liberated the city, Franz Joseph had sought out the help of the Russian Tsar Nicholas I. The young emperor literally got on his hands and knees and begged the Tsar for help. And the Tsar was all too happy to assist, for Nicholas saw the threat that a young independent liberal democracy on his borders would cause immense disruption within his own empire. Thus, a massive Russian army of 200,000 marched into Hungary, crushing the revolution by the summer's end. After a series of lost battles, the Hungarians faced logistical and morale problems. They would surrender to the Russian army in early October 1849. Habsburgs responded with brutal retribution. 13 leading Hungarian generals were executed in the city of Arad, a day which will forever be etched into Hungarian memory. Lajos Batthyány, would be executed by firing squad in Buda, personally shouting the firing order at the soldiers in 3 separate languages. Word of Austrian cruelty at Orod spread quickly. The generals had supposedly clinked their glasses of beer after each execution, prompting Hungarians to abstain from clinking their glasses for 150 years, a tradition which still continues to this day in some circles. Emperor Franz Joseph's forces reinstated harsh censorship, reinstated German as the official language, and imposed punitive taxes on Hungary. Ethnic minorities who aided the Habsburgs fared no better. Their demands for recognition and autonomy were ignored. As a bitter Hungarian saying goes, when speaking to Croatians, what we received as punishment, you received as a reward. This, despite the Austrians' complete reliance on the help of Croatians, Slovaks, Serbs, and Romanians to put down the Hungarian freedom fight. The many manifest problems of the empire, which had caused the whole liberal uprising to begin with, were swept under the rug and allowed to fester. Széchenyi was ultimately proven correct in the end. A slow, gradual transition to independence would have been better for Hungary, for the zealous fire of revolution would ultimately undo more than 50 years of work by Hungarians to build a new modern nation. Széchenyi did not play a significant role during the Hungarian Revolution. In 1848, he became chronically ill and retired from public life. For the remainder of his life, he carried the weight of guilt, blaming himself for Hungary's subjugation. In September 1848, overwhelmed with despair, he attempted to end his pain by throwing himself into the Danube, but was rescued from the waters. By 1860, however, Széchenyi had lost all hope. Fearing retribution and arrest by the Habsburgs, he tragically used the pistol to end his suffering. Rumors quickly spread that the Austrians had murdered him and staged his death to look like a self-inflicted wound, a claim that remains unproven to this day, but which may still be true. Meanwhile, Lajos Kossuth fled into exile, never to see his homeland again. Yet he did not abandon hope. He dedicated the rest of his life to keeping the dream of Hungarian independence alive. Welcomed initially by the Ottoman Sultan, Kossuth was given refuge before embarking on a tour of England and the United States. Fluent in English, he tirelessly worked to expose Austrian atrocities to garner international support for Hungary's cause. Kossuth's arrival in England and the U.S. was met with tremendous fanfare. His fiery oratory and dedication to freedom captivated audiences, and he quickly became a romanticized figure in the press. In the U.S., he met with the president and addressed Congress as an honored guest. He then embarked on a nationwide tour that sparked the Kossuth craze. Streets, schools, and even a county in Iowa were named in his honor. Moreover, a bust of Kossuth was given to the U.S. Congress. Today, it sits in the Capitol Building Rotunda, and it is one of the only 2 commemorating foreigners in the Capitol Building. Kossuth later sought support from Napoleon III and would eventually join the Italian unification movement, hoping to align with Italy in a war against Austria. Despite his relentless efforts, he never succeeded in liberating Hungary. Kossuth died in 1894. His body posthumously returned to Hungary for a national ceremony. A steadfast advocate of reformist liberal ideals, he passed away without ever seeing an independent Hungary. But his legacy endured as a symbol of unwavering dedication to freedom and democracy. Stay tuned for part 3, where we will be looking at the long-term aftermath of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848.